Is man still a part of nature? We've come into a new era, the era of mankind. Today we accept that the earth has been sufficiently impacted by the hand of man for us to consider we are in a new era. Scientists have given this new era a name, the Anthropocene, a new era, that of mankind. Only 500 years ago, the massive and fascinating American continent was still principally made up of unspoiled nature and populated by Indians. It has become a new world, America. And the United States of America has become the foremost world economic power. The transformation was so rapid that any evolution between man's interaction with nature is even more concentrated in this country than elsewhere. This is the story we're going to tell. The universal story of man's interaction with his environment. Just off the coast of the sprawling city of Los Angeles, a few miles out to sea, there's a unique place where this whole story unfolds. The Channel Islands Archipelago. 7 volcanic islands located off the coast of California, and that are the perfect laboratory for a journey back in time, back to where things started. Here we find all the traces left by man during the course of his conquest of the mainland, all the evidence that allows us to explore the periods that made America what it is today. In these canyons and these valleys, on these cliffs eroded by the wind, the rain, and the ocean, archaeologists have discovered the earliest dated human remains on the North American continent. Here, in 1959, archaeologist Phil Cummings Orr made one of the 20th century's greatest discoveries in the New World. In Arlington Canyon, barely a meter under the ground, Phil Orr found 3 pieces of human femur. 3 fossilized bones from a skeleton 13,000 years old. There, before the scientists' eyes, were a fragment of Arlington Springs man, the oldest American ever discovered.
There's a variety of evidence that's now coming together, both archaeological, linguistic, genetic, that suggests that people followed coastal routes along the North Pacific. So from an origin in perhaps the Ryukyu Islands or Japan or Northeast Asia, they traveled in boats along coastlines up around Alaska, down into North America, and then all the way down into the southern tip of South America.
Arlington Springs man descends from these families of adventurous hunters and fishermen who dared come to the American coast for the first time. It's hard to imagine the beauty of this continent that had evolved for several 100 million years before man dared set foot on its soil. It's difficult to imagine that millions of birds must have filled the skies, blocking out the sun during their migration. Arlington Springs man's ancestors must have beheld a beauty that we could never recreate. Unspoiled America. An immense country, endless coastlines, a whole world carved out with estuaries, bays, and seas where fabulous wildlife came to play. How many whales, dolphins, killer whales, and fish could be counted in just one day's sailing? The sea and the land were simply teeming with natural resources, and the groups of hunters and families were very vulnerable. The gigantic forces of nature prevailed over these tiny men. The unwavering motivation of these veritable pioneers encouraged them to continue this epic journey for several generations.
Anthropologists and archaeologists tend to think that something pushed people, and I think there were forces that were pushing people in many migrations. But in this kind of case, I just think human curiosity in a new landscape where no human had ever been before. They would have just wanted to know what's around the corner, what's around the next corner, what's around the next. These people would have been coming down the coast or going up the rivers, yet openly wanting to explore around the next point, just to see what was there.
This curiosity, this desire to learn, this passion for discoveries which is specific to mankind, led them to discover the whole of the continent. It took several centuries for them to complete this migration, but their progress was made easier by a fascinating marine ecosystem. For 20,000 kilometers, to the north of Asia as along most of the American west coast, grow giant seaweed. Kelp, which grows over 40 meters in length, building breathtaking underwater structures. These giant forests are among the richest ecosystems on the planet. They harbor numerous species and are the equivalent of our tropical forests on land. During their sea travels, the small groups of traveling men and women could make use of this food store without ever threatening the natural equilibrium of the forests. The shellfish, the fish, the sea mammals were more or less the same throughout their journey. They followed the American coast southwards on what is today known as the Kelp Highway. When they arrived level with the Channel Islands, the kelp forest became even thicker, and the water temperature was suddenly higher. They were entering an exceptional zone.
One of the things that makes the California Channel Islands special and the kelp forest there really remarkable is that they're on a biogeographical boundary. They're at the edge of the warm water that comes up from the south in Baja California and further south, with the cold water that comes down from the Gulf of Alaska along the North American coast. Right? And they mix. They hit right here along the islands along the California coast. So we have the mixing of warm water and cold water. We have the larvae that come from the rockfishes and the octopus and the things of the north that come down here and interact with the lobsters and tropical, subtropical fishes from the south, and they come together at this place. But what you also have is, as you get variations in ocean currents that swing back and forth, we call it El Nino events. So for several years, it may seem like we're in Baja California, and then several years later, it's like we're in Oregon or Washington or Southeast Alaska, and it shifts back down again. So you get this shifting back and forth. So along 70, 80, maybe 100 kilometers of the islands, you have 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers of the biodiversity of North America in one place. And it changes year to year, time to time. And you can begin to understand then the possibilities of what will happen as we look to the future as the world changes, both in natural and anthropogenic changes. We have a little model of that right here at the California Channel Islands.
An island. The possibility of a new world. The families who discovered the Channel Islands may have understood that they had finally arrived. Wildlife was so abundant here that it could have provided an unlimited supply of food for all of them forever. But what was most exceptional, the great particularity of these islands, which were just far enough from the coast, was the total absence of any predators. They just touched down on a land large enough to meet the needs of an entire people, where there were no bears, no wolves, no tigers, and no men. What name would they give to this Garden of Eden, they who did not know the Garden of Eden? At this period in time, the sea level was 150 meters lower. Before their eyes were vast beaches peppered with seals, sea lions, and elephant seals who'd never seen man before.
When the humans first reached the islands, I think, number one, they were much larger. Sea levels were much lower. There was much larger land area, 2 to 3 times larger than today. And there were a lot of plant resources, and the marine resources must have been phenomenally abundant. The Channel Islands in California must have seemed like a paradise.
What does a natural paradise become when man sets foot in it for the first time? The first group that discovered the islands certainly didn't yet know, but its descendants were going to remain here for over 13,000 years. When they arrived, the 4 northern islands were still linked, forming one large landmass separate from the mainland. The raised platforms that linked the islands together at that time were marshes, in which migrating birds would come to rest for a while on their journeys. Inland was as much a paradise as the coastal areas.
When any human enters a new environment, there are ecological changes as a result of their influences. These were expert hunters, they were expert fishermen, and they were a new deadly predator that was entering this new world, right? So if we put it in that sort of context, they had impacts. They certainly had impacts. And that footprint, their impact on those ecosystems would have probably been very, very minor. But we know it wasn't insignificant, right? If people are coming and first colonizing the islands, they're going to change the behaviors or change the ecological structures in place.
From fossils that have been recovered from the Channel Islands, the terrestrial fossils that have come off the islands. This is a collection of fossils that have come from San Miguel and Santa Rosa Island out of a series of paleontological sites. This is an extinct species of puffin that used to live on San Miguel Island and went extinct. So this is a burrow nesting seabird that nested on San Miguel Island during the latter part of the Pleistocene, and for one reason or another, its population went extinct. So another species which went extinct on the islands is Candites, or a flightless goose. And here's an example of flightless goose bone that has come off of San Miguel Island. And this is out of a single site on San Miguel Island, and it's a whole variety of bones associated with the flightless goose. And it was a fairly large-sized goose that lost its ability to fly. This is the humerus of this big bird, had been reduced to a really small size. So we have evidence that Native Americans hunted this species, both on the mainland and on the islands. And we assume that hunting pressure from Native Americans ultimately resulted in the extinction of flightless geese, both on the Channel Islands and along the west coast of North America, along this part of the North American coast.
The Channel Islands are a favorite with archaeologists. The cliffs, which are hard to access, are well preserved, and the constant erosion regularly reveals remnants of the past. Not only have scientists discovered Arlington Springs man, but excavations have also revealed the bones of several pygmy mammoths. The most complete specimen in the world was discovered on Santa Rosa Island. These perfectly conserved skeletons have allowed for a better understanding of how these mammoths took refuge on these islands. These enormous woolly mammoths swam out to the Channel Islands. When the level of the oceans was 100 meters lower, the channel that had to be crossed was only a dozen kilometers wide. But the great mammoths found themselves trapped on the islands. The sea level rose, and with it a large part of their territory and of their food disappeared. To adapt to this change and reduce their needs in food, the species evolved over several millennia to half of its previous size. However, we still do not know how these pygmy mammoths disappeared from these islands. Even if it's clear that man hunted mammoths on the mainland, there is no proof that he also hunted them on the islands.
One of the big questions on the Channel Islands are, what is the relationship between mammoths and humans? And right now, based on the archaeological record that we have right now, I can't say for sure that both humans and mammoths overlapped on the islands, that they were there at the same time. However, one thing I am almost certain of, nearly certain of, is that we don't have evidence of the first people to arrive to the islands. And that's because 70% of that island landscape, of what it looked like when people probably first got there, is now underwater. So we're missing an incredible amount of the record.
It may be that beneath the seas there are remains that are older than Arlington Springs Man. If archaeologists want to reveal America's full history, one day they will have to excavate the seabed around the islands. These caves, carved into the sides of the volcanoes, were once out in the open air and looked out onto the beach 13,000 years ago. Man discovered the islands just as the Ice Age was coming to an end. The sea level had already started rising slowly, flooding the beaches and marshes. In just a few thousand years, man also had to adapt to the changes in his environment. To get access to new resources, the inhabitants of the Channel Islands burned part of the shrubs and trees that covered the islands. That way, they cleared off land and could dig up buried tubers. After the arrival of the first discoverers, the groups that colonized the mainland, the increasing population of the islands became sedentary, building villages. They were the Chumash Indians of California.
The Chumash were maritime hunter-gatherer fisher peoples. And when you compare their population densities to other hunter-gatherers around the world and in North America, they appear to have had the highest densities of people per square kilometer of any hunter-gatherer group that ever existed. They had not just villages, but towns with hundreds and hundreds, sometimes as many as 1,000 people living in a single town. And they also had a huge and extensive network of trade with other groups on the islands, on the mainland, in the interior, and they were moving materials all around Southern California from group to group. That trade, this really intensive trade in the Santa Barbara Channel area, was driven partly or facilitated by a shell bead money.
The inhabitants of the Channel Islands were behind the unique currency in this region. Beads carved from small shells that they threaded onto strings to make valuable necklaces and bracelets. Their name, Chumash, comes from this technique. They were bead makers. As all over the rest of the world at that time, the Channel Islands people started by colonizing a virgin territory. They settled in and their population grew. They learned new techniques, new ways of doing things, set up exchanges, currency, commerce, and a system of hierarchy. But contrary to the rest of the world, the Chumash never used agricultural tools or animal husbandry to provide themselves with food. The extraordinary marine ecosystem surrounding the islands was always sufficient for their needs.
In some ways, humans are similar everywhere. And when they're coping with abundance, when things are really abundant, then I don't think they act very conservatively. They don't conserve things because they're not worried about it. But as you start to reduce your resources, as you start to have impacts on an island ecosystem or any other ecosystem, I think humans are also similarly ingenious enough to realize that they need to more carefully manage their resources if they want to sustain their lifestyle. And so I think on the Channel Islands, we probably see evidence for sort of initial colonization where there was probably some heavy hunting, but I suspect that those people learned lessons through time. And the fact that they ate the same basic resources for 10,000 years suggests that they did learn how to live more or less sustainably on the islands.
The original people, the first people who showed up, had an impact. It was just localized, and it was on the few species that they really had access to. But you can see in the archaeological record where they threw their trash away, it's layered, and you can see that. And at the bottom of those layers, when they first arrived at a site, the abalone shells are this big, and they got smaller and smaller and smaller. And they shifted from the species that were available just at the shoreline. They would shift into deeper water. There were fewer of them. And until they ran out, and then that site will go inactive for several hundred years, right? And then it starts over again. It suggests that a village was set up on a site. They were active there for many generations of people, but then things were bad. But they only had to move down the coast, and they had a whole new place because there was no people there. What has changed in the 20th century, in my lifetime, is we've run out of new places to go. There are no new places on Earth. From the bottom of the ocean all the way to the top of the mountains, we're occupying every space for the first time in human history.
Channel Island peoples living on the islands for 10,000 years, they must have been keen observers of nature. They were active participants in nature. They were clearly taking millions of shellfish and fish and marine organisms out of nature to sustain themselves. But many Native American tribes do that in a ritual way where they believe they are part of that natural system. and they say prayers to the animals that give up their lives to sustain them, and they find ways through ritual and management practices to care for the environment around them.
In 1542, the first Portuguese ship anchored off the shores of the Channel Islands. This presaged the coming of an irreversible change in the natural balance of the islands. Christianity was arriving in the New World. Two centuries after this first visit, the Spanish Franciscan brothers were building their first missions on the continent.
I believe Franciscans came over from the very earliest times, even with some of the voyages of Columbus, and their objective was to preach the Christian faith, the gospel of Jesus Christ, to the people who lived in the New World, to convert them to the Catholic faith of the Christian religion. From the point of view of these missionaries, I mean, they felt they had the true faith, and it was superior to any other kind of religious system. And that what they were giving to the people from their point of view was a tremendous gift. They were providing a superior technology, education, way of looking at the world, culture, identity, that as a typical colonial attitude, and that other people should be very grateful to receive what they have given to them. It's a terrible, terrible evil inflicted on the people from our perspective 200 years later.
The Franciscan priest Junipero Serra represents the brutal change and bloody heritage of the colonization of this part of America. Considered as the architect of the California missionary system, he was the first to come ashore to build the first 9 missions on the coast. The arrival of this little man who walked with the aid of a stick marked the beginning of the dramatic transformation of the landscape and the death of the peoples who depended on it. Neither the Spanish nor the Portuguese discovered America. The Indians had been there for at least 13,000 years. Yet one of the first things the missionaries did was to give a name to this land and the islands, thus appropriating them. Thus, Limu, literally in the sea, became Santa Cruz, the Holy Cross. Tucan became San Miguel. Huima, Santa Rosa. Then Santa Barbara, Santa Catalina, San Clemente, and San Nicolas.
They baptized the land, then they baptized the people, then they changed their names. And when they put the Spanish names, imposed the Spanish names on everything, then they were imposing their Spanish Christian reality on everything in those places and creating that as a reality.
The reality of the Old World brought along modern agricultural and animal husbandry techniques. So, for the first time in the continent's existence, the fertile soils of Chumash country were plowed. For the first time, foreign seeds were planted in line. Streams were diverted. For the first time, groups of animals were domesticated, penned in, and stopped from moving around freely transforming these wild lands into vast pastures. Very soon, the Chumash Indians could no longer find the wild grains they depended on. It was impossible for them to build up stocks, create reserves, and exchange with neighboring communities. It soon became clear that the establishment of missions was wiping out the structure of the natural world upon and around which the Indians had built their livelihoods over thousands of years. Weakened by the disintegration of their way of life, sick from their episodic contact with Europeans, they had no other choice than to leave the islands and come knocking at the mission's doors. In exchange for the hospitality the priests offered them, the Indians helped perform communal tasks and major works. They raised animals, became farmers, builders, workmen, cooks, or musicians.
When you look at the other colonizing societies coming in on top of the original nations and peoples and working to destroy the traditional economies and ways of life of the original peoples, you see a whole different mindset arriving. And that is one of exploitation and one of destruction, one for the purposes of building wealth and being able to build empires. And those are very, very destructive ways of life. So I think we see the devastation of ecosystems, of waterways, as a direct result of those kinds of patterns.
The Spanish missionaries came to create their own Garden of Eden on the southern coasts of California. They wanted to share with the Indians, who they looked upon as young children, the fruit of their work and their knowledge. For almost 50 years, the 21 missions in California prospered on Indian territory.
In the book of Genesis, there are two different stories about the relationship between humans and the environment. In one story, it says that humans are a part of nature and they should coexist with nature. And the other story is that humans are not part of nature, they're disconnected, and nature is there to serve humans. And so humans should extract from nature what they need. Right? So that's two very different ways to understand and to think about the world. I mean, it pretty well sums up the modern dichotomy that we have with our relationship with nature, and humans' relationship with nature. Are we a part of it? Do we want to coexist with nature? Or are we here to conquer nature and make it work for human systems?
The Channel Islands were completely emptied of their inhabitants. Once the Chumash's interaction with nature and other men had come to an end, they went to seek refuge in the missions, where all they found was sickness and forced labor. The average lifespan once they'd passed the mission's doors was 8 years. The Franciscan priests were faced with terrible failure, as they saw thousands of Chumash perish within their walls, killed by syphilis or epidemics of measles. 4,000 Chumash Indians are buried beneath this tree in the gardens of the Santa Barbara Mission. Half of the population disappeared whilst in the missionaries' care. The Chumash themselves built the walls of the very missions which finally became their tombs. They didn't need oranges or grapes or European sheep to survive. They considered themselves as a part of nature in the same way as a flower, a bird, or a tree. The episode of the very first peoples of America and the life they led for over 13,000 years on the islands is just a small part of the story of man and his interaction with the environment. The arrival of the Europeans marked a brutal turning point, and the Channel Islands became void of all human presence. In the next episode, which will tell the story of California when it was colonized for a little over 200 years during the 18th and 19th centuries, the Channel Islands will undergo a massive transformation and a veritable ecological drama.
We have gone from being small, isolated populations that nature could extinguish to being a dominant force on the landscape and on the seascapes. We've come to dominate the earth just in the last few hundred years. So people's relationships with each other and with nature have changed dramatically.
Upon hearing of the rich new lands in the American West, dozens of thousands of pioneers will cross land and sea to come and exploit the resources that seem to be inexhaustible in this region. The fur trade will wipe out the island's sea mammal populations. Asia and Europe will set up a worldwide market to split the new continent's riches. Thousands of tons of shellfish, mother of pearl, and blubber from large sea animals will be exported to the Old World. The maritime resources will be the first to be pillaged. But the inland areas of the islands will also be devastated. The unique destiny of the Channel Islands tells the history of California. All of the islands will be used to breed animals. And in the ranches, the farmers will come with their European habits. The thousands of sheep, cows, horses, geese, dogs, cats, rats, pigs, grains, plants, trees. They will bring with them a whole set of new species which will upset the natural balance in place here. The destiny of one of the islands in particular will be the reflection of California's industrial development and success. Santa Catalina. The town of Avalon will be built here and will attract all the beautiful people of Los Angeles, the follies and the fortunes of these successful families from the mainland. The island's owner, a chewing gum tycoon, will offer the use of Catalina's heavenly landscapes to the big cinema studios. Over 600 films will be shot on the beaches, and the island will become a mecca for all Hollywood, accommodating all the stars of the period, from Charlie Chaplin to Marilyn Monroe. As a final blow for the islands and the last chapter of this period in history, America will enter the Second World War, and the Channel Islands will become a naval base and a military training center. The U.S. Navy, the Secret Services, the elite Air Force troops, present during the war years, will also leave a profound imprint on people's minds and on the island's lands. The remains of the ranches and vast pasture lands that still cover the islands are the witness of this upheaval, of this period that made America what it is, which shaped the dream of the great American West at the expense of exceptional wildlife. The hills and valleys were made into deserts. The vegetation that had been evolving here for thousands of years was raised. This dying nature will be a cry of alarm for scientists, and the islands will get a new start with their restoration and environmental awareness. The Great Restoration. Through the stigma and scars borne by the islands, the next episode will tell 2 more centuries of the moving and universal history of man and nature, the story of the decline of the environment faced with the growth in power of man the conqueror.